Our gel is done running now. Let's shut off the power, take the lid off. Just gonna pour that buffer back into the box. You can see the pre-stain standards on the gel and how they've run. This, because we're using these precast gels, the gel plates are welded together, they're plastic and they're welded together. We're going to use this little device to gently separate the plates. So I'm just sticking it in there, working my way around, gently pulling apart these two plates. As soon as the gel stops running, you need to set up for transfer. So you can't do it an hour later, you can't do it the next day, you have to do it immediately. Because just like in Agros gels, your bands are starting to diffuse as soon as you shut off the electricity. Okay, so now I'm going to pull off this plate, the ones with the lane markers on them, and the gel is stuck to this plate. So for these gels, they're called TGX gels. It's a proprietary gel made from Biorad. They've got a dye in them, very similar to the dye that was in your Agros gels that stain DNA. There's a dye in this gel that stains protein that you can see after you activate the gel with a special wavelength of light. So this is because we are using these Biorad gels, and we have this Biorad imager, and we have the stain-free tray. See that right there, stain-free tray. That allows us to do this. So normally you would not be able to stain a gel before transfer. Staining the gel does normally is it precipitates the proteins in the gel. And if you precipitate the proteins in the gel, then you can't use electrophoresis to get them out of the gel. And that's what we're going to do when we do the blot. But because we're just using this proprietary stain-free technology from Biorad, it allows us to look at the separation of the proteins before we transfer, and then we'll look at them again after we transfer. Same gel, same sensitivity before and after transfer. Now I'm going to set up the gel for transfer. This is the transferring apparatus called the semi-dry blot apparatus. It has these large electrodes. The whole surface here is an electrode, the surface is an electrode, and these electrodes are platinum coated, so they're expensive and they conduct electricity well. And the idea is that you put a piece of filter paper with soaked in buffer on there, you put your gel on there next, and then the PVDF and the... So the gel I have in my tray here, and I'm going to trim the gel such that I'm going to look at just the area of the gel I want to transfer. You trim the gel with a pizza cutter. Allows you to cut the gel without tearing it. Whenever you handle a gel, you want to handle it from the bottom. That's the toughest part, and you want to try not to rip it. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off the stacker where the wells are, okay, because they don't have any protein that I'm interested in. And then I'm going to use my pre-stain standards as a guide as to where to cut the gel for transfer. So I know my protein is on this side of the gel from where the pre-stain standards are, and I've cut the gel. So this part here I'm not interested in, and then this part here, which we got the lanes in it, I'm not interested in that. And the remaining part I want to measure and then make two pieces of filter paper that are exactly the size of the gel. So it's important that it be exactly the size of the gel, because if it's too big, the electricity that's flowing through this apparatus would much easier go through the part that does not have a gel in the sandwich. So if I make these filter papers too big, then they will have parts that are hanging over the gel, and the electricity would go through those parts more easily than it's going to go through the parts with the gel. You need it to go through the parts with the gel in order to transfer the proteins out of the gel. And so I'm taking some care now to make a piece of filter paper that is the exact size of my gel. Okay, I'm going to say that's fine. I need 2 pieces like that to make my sandwich. So I'm going to use the first one as a template to make the second one. And then I'm going to cut a piece of PVDF. PVDF is in this roll here. PVDF is the most expensive part of this bit. I guess the antibodies are the most expensive part. But this little roll of PVDF, which is enough to do several blots, a couple dozen blots. Always handle PVDF with gloves on, because the job of PVDF is to bind protein. There's protein all over your hands. And if you do not handle it with gloves on, then you can get protein fingerprints on your PVDF that'll show up in your blot, and you can ruin your roll of PVDF. Okay, so now I have 2 pieces of filter paper that are the right size, and I have a piece of PVDF that is the right size. Now this is also important. The PVDF comes wrapped in wax paper, so there's wax paper on either side of it, and the stuff you want is the really white paper inside, in between. You want to get rid of the wax paper. So here's the stuff in between. I also want to point out that the PVDF membrane is hydrophobic. So here I have my transfer solution, which has some methanol in it, but is mostly a hydrophilic environment. And if I try to wet the PVDF in the buffer, nothing happens, okay? It doesn't look wet. As opposed to if I try to wet the buffer pad, the filter paper, you can see that it gets wet, okay? Here's another one so you can see that on camera. You can see it gets wet, okay, up in the corner there. So I'm gonna wet those, they get wet. So how do I make the PVDF wet? You have to use methanol. We have a squirt bottle of methanol here, and you use that to wet down the PVDF. So hopefully you can see that it's getting wet with the methanol, but not without the methanol. So if you forget this step, wetting the membrane, the PVDF membrane with methanol, your blot will not work. So you have to wet that membrane in order for it to bind protein. So you just squirt methanol on the membrane over your transfer buffer, which is this thing I'm rocking back and forth. So now my buffer pads and my PVDF are all sitting in transfer buffer, and the recipe for the transfer buffer is on your protocol. And I've cut my gel to size over here. So now I'm going to assemble my sandwich. You can put it anywhere on this electrode. I'm going to put it right in the middle since it's the only one that we are using today. And as I'm laying down these soaked pieces of filter paper, I'm making sure that there's no bubbles underneath it. That's important because if there are bubbles underneath it, electricity doesn't like to go through the bubbles, and you'll get a visible bubble showing up on your blot of where things did not transfer. So I'm making my sandwich. I put down the bread first, then next the salami, or maybe it's tahini or tofu for you vegetarians. I'm going to grab the gel from the bottom, that's the thickest, toughest part of the gel, and see it's wavy like that. I'm going to attach the top edge to the top edge of my filter paper, and then I'm going to just lay it down nice and even across the whole blot. I can see the pre-stain standards really well. Now next, I got my bread and my salami, or tofu. Next I'm going to put some cheese. I guess this would be lettuce for you vegans, to make my sandwich. This is going to go on top of the gel. The PVDF goes on top of the gel. Again, remember, the bottom electrode is negative. The top electrode that I'm going to put on top of this whole thing is positive. All the proteins are negative. As they get pulled toward the positive pole out of the gel, they will hit the PVDF and hopefully stop. And then my sandwich is now complete after I put a different piece of bread on top. This is the filter paper. Again, I'm laying it down carefully not to get any bubbles in there. So it's filter paper, gel, PVDF, filter paper, or bread, salami, cheese, bread. Just gonna roll back and forth sandwich to make sure there's no bubbles in there. I'm gonna use just a test tube for that, like a rolling pin, and just gentle pressure from top to bottom, from side to side. If there were any bubbles in my stack, which I was careful not to do, this should push them out of the way. Again, bubbles mean no transfer in that part of your blot. Now I'm going to take the top electrode, okay, and I'm going to take some transfer buffer, get my fingers wet, and just rub on this top electrode so there's good electrical contact between the top and the bottom. You can only put the top electrode on the bottom electrode in one orientation, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take it upstairs and hook it up to a power supply that can supply constant current for the 2 hours of my transfer. And I'm going to set that for 1 square centimeter per milliamp. So depending on the area of your blot or how many blots you're transferring, you set for more current. And that amount of current for a solid 2 hours. There it is with a weight on it, red to red, black to black. Here's the power supply, and I set it for 80 milliamps because it's about 80 square centimeters, 2 hours. And I'm going to say run. This should be relatively low voltage. So 2 volts is producing 80 milliamps. And then you'll see this timer countdown for 2 hours. After it's done, the power supply will shut off, and there's enough liquid in those buffers to keep the blot moist overnight. You want to keep your blot moist, not let it dry out. And then in the morning, I will take apart the sandwich and start the blocking. Transfer has completed, and now I'm going to take apart this transfer device, and I'm going to block the blot and stain the gel. Okay, so taking this apart and stuck to the top electrode here, peel apart my sandwich. Here's the buffer pad, and then the gel. I'm going to put the gel tray. Normally what you would do with the gel is you would stain it with a Kamasi based stain, and this would allow you to see what proteins are remaining in the gel after the transfer. That's really important because you can assess, did I have enough protein on that gel, and also how well did the proteins resolve. So the proteins are all blurry lines on there. You're not going to see anything on your blot because that will also be blurry and not concentrated bands of protein. For this particular brand of precast gel, there's a stain in there, proprietary stain in there, that I can just image without putting it in the Kamasi. So that's why I'm not sticking in there. You can't stain before you do the transfer, because what the stain does is it precipitates the proteins in the gel and prevents them from moving in the gel, and so you can't stain before. You can only stain after, because you want to get the proteins out of the gel. Now if I look at my blot, you'll see that the pre-stain standards have moved onto the blot, and you can see them, and that's really handy. I know this is the top of the blot, that's the bottom of the blot, and I can see where those pre-stain standards are. And you'll see the other protein lanes are not labeled because they don't have stain on them. And as we talked about before, you can see the pre-stain standards because the stain is covalently labeled. Now what I'm doing is I'm putting it in a blocking solution. We use non-fat dry milk as our blocking solution. The blocking solution is just a solution of protein. That solution of protein, we're going to fill up all the spots on that blot where there isn't already protein from the transfer. And I'll draw you a little diagram of that. Then this is going to shake for an hour at the least. You can keep it in this blocker for weeks if you put in something to prevent bacterial growth in the milk. After it's blocked, we'll put the antibody on, and I'll show you how to do that. In terms of cleaning up the electrodes, just take off the buffer pads, add some water, and then you really want to scrub down the surface in order to keep the electrodes in good shape, and then you just allow it to dry at the air before you put it back together, so nothing funky will grow on here. I'll show you an old transfer apparatus that was not taken care of as well, and the problems with that. So what happens on these that haven't been taken care of so well, you get pitting where there have been individual blots and they were not cleaned and taken care of well. So, all right, what is happening during the blocking step? On your blot that you just took off the transfer, there are proteins on there. You can't see them, but they're on there. They're transferred onto there. You can see the pre-stain standards because, again, they have the covalent bond to the dye. But the proteins you're interested in are not stained. The job of that PVDF membrane is to bind protein. And if you directly put the antibody on the membrane without blocking first, what happens is the antibody will bind all over the membrane, because the membrane binds proteins and antibodies are proteins. So to prevent that from happening and only allow it to stick to your protein and nothing else, you put a generic protein on the blot to fill in all the places. So we use milk, and all those milk proteins, what they do is they fill in all the spaces around the bands that you transferred, and they block your antibodies from binding to those open spaces. Okay, that's why it's called a blocker. So any kind of protein solution that doesn't have your antigen in it is a good blocker. And scientists like cheap. Milk is cheap, so we use non-fat dry milk. You can also use serum. You can use bovine serum albumin. Lots of different blockers are used in different applications. Okay, so let's say this area is now blocked. I can come in, and now my primary antibody will bind here, and then my secondary antibody will bind to the primary antibody, and the secondary antibody has a fluorescent tag on it, so I'll be able to see that. If I didn't do this blocking, these antibodies would bind all over the blot and the whole thing would light up, which is not what I want. I just want my antigen to light up. So that's why you do blocking. All right, we are done now with blocking. It's still sitting in the milk, and we're ready to apply our primary antibody. Some labs put the primary antibody in the blocker. We don't do that. So I'm going to pour that off, and then briefly rinse this blot in PVDF. just give it a couple moves like that. I still don't want to touch the blot, so I'm going to use some forceps, and I'm going to place the blot into this Mylar foil package. So there's lots of different ways you can incubate antibodies. With a blot, some people put it inside of a tube and let the tube roll around with the antibody. We like to put it inside a little pouch like this, because then we can ensure that it's not going to leak. So I'm just heat sealing the edges of this pouch here. The other big advantage is the blot will get completely saturated with the antibody, and you can use a very low volume of antibody solution, which saves you money. So there's my sealed 3 edges here. Now I'm going to add 5 milliliters of PBS plus BSA. So the BSA it acts to keep the antibodies from denaturing. Some proteins will denature just by being dilute. Antibodies are used to sitting in serum, which is a concentrated protein solution. When you put them in a dilute solution, they can denature. So BSA is a protein that's found in serum. It's called bovine serum albumin, and it will keep the antibody protected and keep it from unfolding. So I've got 5 milliliters of my carrier solution for the antibody in there, and now I'm actually going to add the antibody. So the antibody, the primary antibody solutions, you're going to want to know what concentration you put the antibody in. I'm going to use a 1 to 1,000 concentration. They range depending on how tightly your antibody will bind to your target. They can range from 1 to 20,000 to as low as 1 to 50. Since I have 5 milliliters of solution there, for a 1 to 1,000 concentration, I would do 5 microliters. 5 microliters in 5 milliliters would be 1 to 1,000 ratio. I want a 1 to 500 ratio, which is 2 times as concentrated. So that's 10 microliters in 5 milliliters. So the primary antibody is not labeled. In this case, it's generated in a rabbit. It's a polyclonal antibody. Here's my 5 microliters. See that? 5 microliters. You want to keep your antibodies cold and aliquot them if you have a big supply of antibodies, so you don't freeze thaw them multiple times. I'm adding that directly to the solution that's already in the blot. You can see, hopefully you can see the blot in there in the little pouch. Now I'm going to seal off that pouch, getting rid of any bubbles first, and I'm going to pick up this so that I don't just let that solution spill out of there. Seal off that edge. Okay, so I get a nice good seal. And then what I do is I tilt it around just to make sure that the fluid can move within the pouch and that I don't have any leaks. Okay, so now that antibody will saturate that blot, and I'm going to write down the information on the blot on the edge of my seal. I won't write it around the middle because the action of your pen writing on the PVDF will put a dent in the PVDF, and that'll collect antibodies. So if you write a message like I love cell physiology on top of your blot, it'll show up on your secondary because the antibodies will collect in there and you'll get a reaction. So to prevent that, I always write my information on the edge of this blot. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick it in the refrigerator on a shaking platform overnight. And at 4 degrees, overnight shaking is about as conservative as you can get for incubating with a primary antibody. You may be able to get a reaction with less time and at warmer conditions, so maybe as little as 30 minutes at room temperature shaking. But the way we think about this is that if it doesn't work with overnight incubation at 4 degrees at a relatively high concentration of the primary antibody, then it's not going to work. You can always optimize it later to save yourself some time and some antibody, and to try to reduce any kind of secondary non-specific reactions. But for this particular antibody, I know those incubation conditions are going to work. So the blot has been incubating in primary antibody overnight, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it out of this pouch and I'm going to wash it briefly in phosphate buffered saline, PBS, and then I will put it in secondary antibody. Now what you wash with and how many times you wash will depend on the particular antibody you're using. And one thing that can be difficult about Western blots is there are so many different things, so many different variables that you can adjust trying to get your blot to look just right. You can adjust how many times you wash, how long you wash, and what you wash with. So this is a very gentle wash in that it is just trying to knock off any non-specific binding of the antibody so that I don't have high background, but the antibody will still stick to its target. In this case, that target is actin. So I'm just going to do that brief wash, and then I'm going to put the blot in. Okay. With the forceps, you have to be a little bit careful in picking up the blot. If you grab onto that blot really aggressively, it'll dent the PVDF, and again, any dent in the PVDF will collect the antibodies and you'll get a bright spot in the shape of your forceps. Okay, so then I've got my two sides sealed. I'm just going to add the PBS plus BSA. This is so that the antibody won't denature just by being dilute. I'm putting 5 milliliters into this pouch. Okay, that's just to carry the antibody and keep it happy. And now I'm going to add the secondary antibody. We're going to use a fluorescently tagged secondary antibody. And that allows us to see wherever the secondary antibody is on the fluorescent imager. Alright, I'm just putting that fluorescently labeled secondary antibody. I'm using this antibody at 1 to 1,000 concentration, which would be, I'm sorry, it was 1 to 500. I'm using it at 1 to 500 concentration, which is 10 microliters in 5 mils of total serum. So this is the secondary antibody. I'm going to label it on the side, secondary, like this, and now this will incubate at room temperature for 3 to 5 hours. And this is another thing that you can optimize: how long you incubate the primary, how you wash it, how long you incubate the secondary, what you use for a secondary, and how you detect that secondary, and then final washes. All right, so the fluorescently tagged antibody is kept in a light tight pouch so that it'll degrade if it's exposed to the light, and then kept in the refrigerator. So I'm going to put that away. This is just a shaking platform to keep the antibody moving over the blot within that pouch. There's another version of this that the first blot sat on in the refrigerator overnight. So this will sit at room temperature. You have to keep your antibodies moving while they're incubating. Otherwise, they'll pool up in certain spots on the blot and you'll get false positive reactions. We've now incubated in our secondary antibody, washed that blot, Then I put the blot in just a clear plastic liner so that it'll stay moist. You want to keep your blots moist. And we're going to image it with this Typhoon. It's a very expensive way to image multiple kinds of tags. So fluorescent tags, chemiluminescent tags, even radioactive tags. Okay, so I'm going to take my blot, I'm going to put it in the corner of the Typhoon here. I'll let you see that. There is the blot in the corner of the what's called the platen, which is just a piece of glass that you're going to put the blot on. I'm going to shut this lid like this, and now I'm going to set up different parameters on the instrument. We're always going to do this with you. I just want to walk you through this, and it might be slightly different. So I'm going to set the size of my blot here so it doesn't scan this whole giant area of glass that you just saw. Then I'm going to set up for fluorescence. I could do chemiluminescence, fluorescence, storage phosphors for radioactivity. I'm going to go to setup. This particular fluorophore that's on my secondary antibodies is 633 nanometer excitation. So I'm going to set that up there. I'm going to say OK. I say yes, I want to continue, and then scan. And it's going to ask me for a name and save. And now it's going to start to warm up. You're going to hear some noises. Now that you have an image that you generated from your Western blot, this is just a digital picture. I want to show you how you can quantify it. So for the examples I gave you where you got to see those images generated by the Typhoon, they are not great examples of like super clean blots, but I just wanted to show you what they look like in black and white, not on that small screen of the Typhoon. So here's one of those images. There's the actin reaction right here. It's also reacting with the standards. This is a result of putting too much primary antibody on there. We're just figuring out the parameters to use these fluorescent secondaries, and I don't quite have them dialed in yet. But in these unknown lanes where it's just a homogenate of worms, you get a very strong reaction against actin. Here is another blot here where most of the blot was blown out in that there was too much signal for the detector to detect. But in this small window, after I washed the blot for a bit, you see again a very distinct band of actin. Here's a couple of markers lanes here, but 2 lanes here. You can just see the edge of one right there, and actin. But that's not really a great example of how to a gel to quantify from. So I'm going to bring up a example gel that is included with ImageJ. ImageJ is software that I downloaded from the web. It's free. If you're a Mac user, it comes you can download it as ImageJ. If you're a PC user, you might have to download it as a program called Scion Image, S-C-I-O-N Image, or I think there's even a version that is completely Java based, so you can just use it on the web. But anyway, I'm just going to open up a sample file that they provide so that I can show you how to quantify a gel. Let's say this was your blot and you wanted to see how much is in this lane versus how much is in this lane. So first on ImageJ, you have to draw a box around the first lane that you want to analyze. And I'm going to say, I'm going to analyze this lane here. And I'm really only interested in that band right there. So I'm just going to draw a box that includes that band. And then I say, analyze, gels, select first lane. And you have to draw the box before you do this. So you select first lane, and you can see there's little 1 there. Now, I just hold down the cursor and drag that box over into the second lane, and then I say analyze, gels, select next lane, and you see a little 2 there. Now I'm going to say analyze, gels, plot the lanes, and it's giving you a plot of pixels. So at the top of the lane here you have low pixel density. As it goes over the band, the dark band, you get a peak of pixel density, and then it trails off again, and then you get a couple little peaks after that. Now in order to quantify, it'll automatically switch over to this line tool, and you just draw a line across the bottom of your peak. So you have to be fair about it, and that you decide for yourself as to where does the peak start and where does the peak end. I'm going to do the same thing for this peak down here. Okay. And then I'm going to go to this Magic Wand tool. It's a Mac, so they're kind of kitschy with their choice of icons, a Magic Wand tool. And I just have to click anywhere within that peak that I have closed off. Okay, you can see, hopefully you can see on there that it has turned yellow, and it's given me a number, an area number. This is a unitless number, but it's a number you can use for statistics. So they're saying the area under the curve for this thing I have outlined in yellow is 27,262.706. Again, that's a unitless number. Now I'm going to go down here and click on that. And again, it highlights it in yellow. And this one is 18,881. So I could use that. These numbers, repetition of these numbers, I get, let's say lane 1 is wild type and lane 2 is knockdown that I did with RNAi, and I can use this to quantify how much the blot is telling me in terms of protein, and then I would plug these numbers into whatever statistical test I was doing, say it's a t-test or whatever. So I would have, say, 5 estimates for wild type, 5 of these type of numbers, and then 5 estimates for the knockdown, say 5 of those type of numbers, and those are the numbers I would compare with statistics.